Hi, this is Shashank Mehta, the founder of Equity Math, a Mumbai-based firm focused on distributing SEBI-registered portfolio management services. Today, we have here with us Mr. Hemant Patel, who is the founder and CIO of Alder Capital, a SEBI-registered portfolio manager. If you want to play the India consumption story, there is no other better PM than Alder. Welcome, sir. Very warm welcome and thanks for this opportunity. I hope we are able to get an inside view of what Alder Capital does for its clients and hope to get the most out of you.
Definitely.
Sir, you started Alder Capital in 2015. What led you to decide to become a SEBI registered PM? If you could tell us how has been your 6-year journey from 2015 to date, and a follow-on could be what do you see for the coming decade?
Genesis of how we started when I was an equity research analyst, and this was way back in 2000, and it's been 15 years since I was there with multiple firms, Axis Capital, Inam, traveling the world, meeting global institutional investors, both domestic and all parts of the world, and advising them about what to invest into Indian equity markets, specific to a sector which is consumption related. And in 2014, we decided to start Alder Capital. That's when I put in my papers and took the journey as an entrepreneur. It so happened that few of my global institutional clients called me to New York and said that why don't you manage a little bit of our assets. With that, we started off the fund, the consumption fund. It so happened at the same time SEBI also came and gave us the PMS license, and that was the beginning of Alder Capital. But we stood to the core. We stood to what we understood most, which is B2C businesses, consumption related. We in a sense have helped a lot of families gain their financial independence, right, in 6 years. We've seen families who have funded their children's education, who have created a tremendous amount of wealth for their retirement, who have bought homes. That's the journey which we are extremely elated with. Wealth creation is a process. It's a lot of patience that's required. A lot of families have done that and achieved this. And we hope that in the next 10 years, we get to touch more lives in this manner. And that will be extremely rewarding and fruitful.
I'd also like to point out that not only Hemant has spent about 19 years covering the consumption story of India, but he's also been voted as the top analyst by Wall Street Journal. So he's the real deal, guys. They say that philosophy is a culmination of what one has read in his academics, what he has learned from his past experiences, and maybe even some fundamental truths that one has experienced while spending so many years in markets. What is Alder's philosophy when it comes to investment management?
Yeah, culmination of experiences has led us to a core philosophy in Alder Capital, which is basically investing into B2C businesses, right? And particularly into businesses that have durable competitive advantages, and also owner operators which have high ethical standards and a desirable culture, right? Now, let me break that down into 3 parts for you. So when we say B2C businesses, we refer to a portion of India's market capitalization, right, which is roughly around 38%, right? There are many other segments of Indian markets, which could be commodities, whereas metal, mining, oil and gas, right? There are export-led businesses, which are IT and pharma, and there are industry and infrastructure and wholesale lending banks, right? These are areas that we do not invest into, but we specialize in where a household typically spends and saves, right? To put you in context, if a household wants to spend on healthcare, we do invest into healthcare services, right? Like diagnostics and hospital chains and the rest. If they have needs for education, entertainment, food, footwear, jewelry, and the likes. Yes, that's what B2C means. It's one of the largest investable segments of the Indian markets. But what's important is durable competitive advantages. There are businesses where we feel that they need to have clear either production side advantages or demand side advantages, right? Which gives them the pricing power to sustain well ahead of its competitors, grow ahead of its competitors and gain market share, and therein create a tremendous amount of value for investors, right? And layer above that is you need to have management which are ethically clean, right? Have got a very productive, innovative, future-ready culture, right? If they are able to manage that, then typically a business tends to do extremely well over a long period of time, and that's where our core philosophy lies. That we try to seek businesses which tick all these boxes.
Under the broader umbrella of consumption, Alder Capital's focus is on B2C businesses that have a durable competitive advantage and that are owner operated. This is a follow-on question. So the philosophy that you described seems very logical, but has it been the same from day one? Could you share experiences from the past that allowed you to shape this philosophy? Any examples that you could think of or quote that led you to what Alder Capital's philosophy is today?
Answer the first question, yes, we have followed our core principles from day one. We don't intend to diverge from it. This is what we have experienced as a core team, and we feel that we can spend valuable time focusing in a narrow sector and create better value out of that rather than trying to do everything. But to answer the second question of learnings, so we did this exercise last year, and it was an exercise where we tried to understand the BSE 500, and we said let's pull businesses out in B2C and B2B both, and try to understand which businesses actually did extremely well during stressful periods in India. Right? And stressful periods in India could be a time of global financial crisis, and even this period that we are talking about where we had multiple reforms and businesses couldn't do as good as what they could have done. And what we got was surprising that in a list of 500 companies, there were 70 businesses which managed to continue growing at 10% compounded revenue growth rate and delivered 15% ROEs, which is over and above the cost of capital. And this was a time when things were traumatic, right, from a business cycle perspective. And when you carve that out and you see those businesses, which are the ones which are counter-cyclical to any external shocks and the environment, you notice that bulk of them, a large portion of those were B2C businesses, which had very high competitive advantages. They had the pricing power, they had the capabilities to expand markets and expand their revenues. So our core philosophy goes in this, that we need to find those businesses which can traverse through these environments. At the same time, the learning is as simple as this. If you find great businesses, which we call it as, which land into the Super 70 list, right? And these are what we call as incredible businesses. You need to hold on to those, right? The power of compounding is incredible, it's magical. And when you hold on to these businesses which seemingly are doing moderate level of growth, fairly much higher level of earnings growth vis-a-vis the broader markets, right? They tend to add value over a long period of time. Before you know it, they're compounding at 15 to 20% per annum at a market cap level, right? And they become multi-baggers. We will talk about this as you have more questions, but quite honestly, our core philosophy all revolves around this essential list that we call it as.
So the Super 70 out of the BSE 500, our client / investors note that these 70 companies, as sir said, clocked a 10% CAGR at 15% ROE even at the worst times, and that possibly is more like an investment universe for Alder Capital.
But I'll add one more thing
Please.
To it, is not only that they outperformed in terms of growth, they outperformed in terms of ROEs and profit, right? But they also did extremely well in terms of market capitalization outperformance, right? Vis-a-vis the benchmark. Okay. And they outperformed the benchmark more than, I think, 2.5 times, right? So essentially, when markets were not delivering great performance, or even at the period post financial crisis when the markets did well, right? These companies extremely outperformed those general businesses across, and that environment. So it's just not fundamental outperformance. We just wanted to drive the point that it's also stock performance as well.
Which is what matters at the end of the day. Now that we've understood Alder Capital's investment philosophy, if we can go one step deeper and understand that when an incoming client/investor comes to Alder Capital, how do you go about creating the portfolio? Do you follow a model portfolio theory, or is it creating individual portfolios, and why so?
We look at internally all our investments by way of competitive advantages and how we can actually revolve a portfolio around that. So there are many businesses which are brand oriented, right? There are businesses which have process scale advantages. There are businesses which have network effects. So right, so we need to actually build a comprehensive list of companies which fit into those buckets. Other managers would look at large, mid, and small. They would look at it as sectoral classifications. Well, those are nice things to have because it makes you quickly understand how your portfolio is constructed. But for us, the core of our heart of the portfolio is basically what do these businesses bring on table, right? And how are they catering to the demand side of it? And what are the advantages? So when we do that, we have a benchmark portfolio internally, and when a new client comes in, the question of how we allocate depends on the market cycle. Give or take, if we were at a situation where we were in April 2020, where the markets had crashed, I probably would have deployed everything that came in that day, right? It's another thing that we all were skeptical at that particular point of time. In hindsight, we said, oh wow, it's a great level to be at. But the point is that when you look at stocks and when you run these analysis on a forward basis, you realize that many of these businesses could deliver a 25 to 30% returns at those levels, right? And if new money did come in at that time, which is rare, right? Many times retail investors do not want to deploy money when the markets are at the bottom most. And if it did, and in one case, a few cases, we did get money, we deployed everything immediately in a week's time. But there are times when the markets are at a peak, we have to peak in the sense that short-term peak, and we feel that there could be a cool off, which could be a 5% cool off. We deploy the money over a 1-2 month period. But at the end of the day, after one is deployed that capital, it will resemble a benchmark portfolio that we run internally, right? Our internal benchmark portfolio will be completely different from a BSE, right? BSE would have a lot of weightages in commodities and in export-oriented business and in banking and financials, right? Which constitute a large part of the BSE weightage. So our internal portfolio is very different from that, but all our clients' portfolios resemble the internal portfolio after, give or take, after 1-2 months, right? So generally, there is no customized portfolio that we operate. It makes it easy for the clients because they wouldn't come back to us and say, hey, your benchmark is doing something else, but my portfolio is underperforming, or maybe the other way around. So at a given point of time, post that point, typically the entire aggregate portfolio of Alder Capital performs in sync with individual client portfolios.
What Sir just explained, for an incoming client/investor who is coming into Alder Capital, the portfolio will be structured using a benchmark portfolio, and the way Alder looks at the portfolio is they divide it into 4 different categories, which we, of course, will know more about as we ask more questions. But primarily, the portfolio gets divided into production capabilities, brands, very high exit costs for consumers, and the 4th is networking effect. As you explained that Alder follows a benchmark portfolio and divides it into like 4 different categories. If you could explain each category giving an example, and also is there a mix that you follow, like a 25% mix for each of these categories? How do you decide category weight versus stock weight, and overall what is the number of stocks that you have typically in a portfolio?
So we look at the portfolio from multiple angles. One, there are businesses which, like you said, there are different competitive advantages, and in competitive advantages, one being the production advantage. Like a DMart has got serious amount of scale advantage, wherein it is able to do an everyday low pricing, pass this on to the customers, and therein it creates a positive feedback loop where customers walk in and there's more revenue achieved per square feet than any other retailer possible, right? So we break these businesses down into that, network effects are those businesses which are consumer tech platform businesses, right? Where you have as more users join the network, the existing users gain out of it, right? There are many plays like your Paytms and Zomatos of the world, including Nykaa to a certain extent, which fall into this category, right? We look at these businesses where they fall in, like brand businesses are essentially consumer discretionary businesses like Tanishq. It could be like a Bata and Relaxo. It could be anything from consumer staples, which could be Unilever, Nestle's of the world. These are brands which fall into that category where a customer is seeking to attach himself to some desirable association, right? And once that happens, the brand equity of goes up, and these brands tend to keep layering themselves with additional products and services, as the case may be, and scale the business in that sense. So when we allocate assets, we do not define saying it has to be 20% here and 30% there. We are seeking businesses which fall into either one of these categories. At a given point of time, we might get some investment which is ticking all the boxes, fits our valuation criteria, seems like it could be a high return on a 5-year period, because that's how we analyze businesses, not on a 1-year basis, and then we allocate. But we just try to make sure that there is no excessive skew on one direction, right? And there's some amount of balance which has been created. In terms of stock weightages, we have another classification. We call businesses as Incredibles, Core, and General. So what we look at is if this is some kind of a business where the advantage is so huge and it cannot be displaced by an existing player or a new entrant, and it's so possible that this business can grow well ahead of the category and the markets, then in that case we would like to invest serious amount of money into this business, which could be at the extent of 10% of a portfolio, right? We call these incredible businesses. The tenure of holding these incredible businesses will be much longer, right? Even beyond 5 years. There are some stocks that we own today for 4 years and beyond, that constitutes roughly around 60% of our assets right now. Then there are another set of businesses which we call as core. This is something where we want to hold for maybe 3 to 5 years, and we would invest somewhere around 7.5% of the portfolio at the top end, right? Then we have a third category which is called as generals, where we feel that there are certain risk criterias where it doesn't tick all the boxes, where we need to evaluate as the business grows before deploying serious money. So in these businesses, we might invest anywhere between 3 to 5%. That's how we size our portfolio up. And for any fine reason, we would not exceed more than 18 stocks in any individual client's portfolio, or even for Alder Capital as a whole. And at the bottom end, we have gone all the way down to even 10 stocks, right? But again, it's dependent on market situations. If we have the opportunities, right, and we would love to see we get many opportunities to invest in, which have got high IRRs over a long period of time, then obviously we will build a little larger portfolio than just having 10 stocks. So on an average basis, around 14 to 15 stocks is where we typically are at for individual portfolios.
If I were to correctly reiterate and summarize what just sir explained, is that while Alder focuses on 4 categories while it goes for building a portfolio, and those 4 categories are production advantage, brand, higher switching cost for consumers, and networking effect. While they decide how much weight to give to a certain stock, they have 3 categories, which is Incredibles, Core, or General. And Incredibles would typically have like a 10% weight. The Core might attract a 7% weight, and the General might attract 3 to 5% weight. And typically a portfolio would have at max 18, max 19 stocks, and depending on opportunity, they might make it slightly more concentrated or again go back to the normal, which depends on market condition. Sir, this is one of my favorite questions. How important is timing in the market? Should an incoming client/investor worry about timing the market, or should he shift his burden to the PM and let him decide when and how to invest? More so, how does Alder decide on when to enter a stock at what price? Could you give some perspective on that?
So it's my favorite answer as well. So We consider our universe to have type A and type B businesses. Type B businesses are those which are mediocre or just about good. Why do we call them as mediocre and good? Is because they don't have serious pricing power or maybe a market share where or a brand where they can actually scale, right? And the customer side of it, the demand side of it might not be as strong as we would desire. In a large basis, these businesses tend to have lower return ratios, lower market shares, lower history of gain in market shares, and maybe managers who are not future ready or not scaling up the businesses in the desired manner. So we call these as mediocre type B businesses. And there are type A businesses where you have all of these, right? The managers are a highly productive culture where innovation, where they're able to expand opportunity size sets and scale the business much faster than the peer group, right? But at a cost or return on investments which are far better than the markets and the peer groups because they have the pricing power in a bigger sense. So we have type A and type B businesses. Type A businesses, what we call it as great businesses, and type B businesses, what we call it as good and mediocre businesses, right? The question comes back to market timing. If you are going to be buying type B businesses, right, then you definitely need to time the market, because what typically happens in a market down cycle, we get to see that people generally tend to sell out on the type B businesses just as a blanket, right? Whether it's mutual funds or FIs. The falls are even dramatic because many people believe that in an adverse market situation or an adverse business cycle, these type B businesses will be impacted the most. They have least pricing power. They will be impacted by, let's say, high inflationary pressures. They'll be impacted by high interest costs and the likes, right? As you keep going on and on and on. Whereas in type A businesses, markets don't really sell them because they feel that, yeah, I mean, it might be selling pressure because somebody wants to exit India, or somebody wants to create a cash, or somebody wants to just hoard up cash saying that I'll wait for the rainy day. But the point is that they're not selling it because of the fundamental flaws in these businesses, and therein the fall is relatively less. So what happens in these type A businesses is after the brief fall, they tend to recover faster because the earnings are accelerating in an adverse market. And that comes to back to the earlier question I had, was the Super 70 list. Those businesses which tend to outperform even in a bad cycle, right? So what our philosophy is simple: do not time the market. And this was not a philosophy that I had when I started managing assets, by the way, I'll be very honest. It took us time to learn. And I think after the 4th year, we slowly realized that while we were great in timing markets, we realized that we couldn't time the markets when the markets were at the bottom most, because markets are most opaque at that stage, right? You could time the markets at the top most because you feel the valuations are at an absurd level and something else is happening. But either case, it's very difficult to time the markets. But we realize that the reward of not timing the markets and holding on to great businesses, you pay less to the government in terms of taxes, you sleep better at night, right? And at the end of the day, the power of compounding takes care of itself. So our entire efforts have actually been to try and seek type A businesses and do away with this type B businesses and market timings. So life becomes a lot more simpler.
This is really interesting perspective on timing that sir just shared, because maximum portfolio managers that I've come across either believe in remaining fully invested, and I think this is more like a hybrid version where if you know that you are investing into type A businesses, it might be much easier to enter into them, while you continue to look for these type A businesses and you continue to believe that you may be able to enter them at any given point in time. फिर भी सर कुछ तो आप टाइमिंग ज़रूर करते होंगे, कुछ सीक्रेट जो आप शेयर कर सकें while you build a position in a certain stock, when you target a 10% weightage in an incredible category, do you do it at one go, or is there a staggered way that you do it?
So here's where I probably need to give you examples, because theory can take us only this far.
Okay.
So let's say that you were to buy Avenue Supermart, right? It IPO'd like close to 6 years back now, 5 years back, give or take. when it came for a listing, it popped. After 299, it popped all the way to around 450, 480, right? Was it cheap then? Absolutely not. It was the most expensive retail stock you could have thought about, right? It was available at 80 times its earnings. Now, one would have said that this makes no sense, right, to buy this, because, well, even if I built power of compounding of its revenues, and if its revenues grew by 25-30%, bottom line it could have grown by maybe around 30 to 35%, and that's all about it, right? That's all you could have thought about. Well, then why should I pay up? Now the funny thing is, the power of compounding is magic, right? When you buy something at 80 times and its earnings grow by 30% in a single year, what happens to the PE is it comes down by 30%, right? So what was seemingly 70 times becomes 50 times. At 50 times, the world was available in India, right? Great businesses which are growing at 2 times or 3 times the growth rate of our nominal GDP, right? Or obviously at a high premium. And many businesses, whether it is levers or the others, are available at that same multiple. Now, if one held on to that pain of, saying, I can't time this, I have no clue how to time it, let me just buy it, right? And it is going to be a painful journey, and probably the stock will fall, and whatever happens, right? Well, if it fell, it would have fallen by 30%. If it didn't fall and it was sideways movement, it would have carried on for sideways movement for 1 year. But then what happened to Avenue after that? After that, the next 4 years were incredible, because from that 450, today the stock price is 4,700. Now, you just missed a multi-bagger, which was 10x. Did you need to time it then? No, absolutely not. What worked for you, instead of timing the market, was the power of compounding, right? So you rather focus on how you can compound your wealth and what can compound your wealth faster, rather than trying to say, oh, can I get it at a 10% discount because the Black Friday is coming? We don't believe in that. You will have Black Fridays at some point of time, but don't try to revolve your world around the Black Friday.
Once a company fits a certain criteria that you mentioned, the broader 4 criterias, how do you really go about selecting a company from the Super 70? How do you, find this needle in a haystack while you've shortlisted out of the BSE 500 these 70 companies? But how does really Alder look at these 70 companies? When can a certain company become a portfolio company?
It's a lot of hard work. Like I said, when we started off, we were equity research analysts. Our passion is to learn businesses. That's what we do for a living. And in that passion to learn businesses, it is a lot of hard work. We have 7 modules that we run within the team. Each one of these modules cover different aspect of what we need to learn about before we buy a business. So these 7 modules will range from industry analysis, management analysis, business analysis, then figuring out the risk factors. Then there's a study which we call as on the ground, where we need to really go out and meet ex-employees, consultants, maybe competitors, distributors, customers, to get surveys out, to understand whether what we are thinking really works in the real world, right? And then we do a financial analysis, and the last part of it we do is valuations, right? We don't revolve our business buy and sell decisions necessarily on valuations. It is something that we want to check in the end, but what we try to focus on is, does it tick all these boxes? If a business ticks all these boxes, and there are very tough questions which are very difficult to answer because these are questions which are never asked before, or the accessibility is poor. Like in case of P&G Health and Hygiene is a business that we own. The management meets investors only once a year at the AGM. Now, if you want to learn about the business, how do you go about learning about the business? The annual report doesn't talk much. There is no publicly available information. A few brokerages actually track it. So it's a lot of hard work to get down and learn, right? And knowledge is available everywhere, right? You just have to seek it. So it's difficult. It might take 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Sometimes we track a company for many years and then they say, we love this company, but we want to wait and we want to see what they do before we buy it. So yes, once we clear these processes and we understand how strong this business is, that's when we decide to buy.
It's essentially a funnel that takes BSE 500 to the Super 70, and these Super 70 again have to pass a rigorous check of 7 different modules and eventually fall into Alder's portfolio. Sir, I really believe that in this neo world, there is no buy and forget. There is rather a appoint and forget. Appoint a PM such as Alder Capital and follow his lead. Question is more on the holding period. How does Alder decide the holding period, and what circumstances trigger a partial or a complete exit? If you could also give examples for each.
So 2 questions. We base our buy decisions on what we call it as 5 and a 10-year analysis, right? We try to forecast businesses. I know that's a difficult thing to do, but at least we need to have some basic understanding of what a business can do and what we think it can achieve given the opportunity size set, right? And given the competitive playground. We try to do that and analyze what a business can fairly be trading at a 5-year down the horizon, and what is the IRR that we probably can get based on current market prices. So it takes away the impact of under or overvaluation issues in the short run, because we tend to have a little longer horizon, and that's how we tend to buy. In some cases, like you might have seen, where managers would buy something and it rises by 200%, right? But for us, the question that we ask is, it may have risen by 200%, right? In case of Bajaj Finance, we bought at 2,500 and it all the way rose to 8,000, right? The question that we were asking is, okay, can you see a 10-year return? We have a model where we are predicting this is what can happen, right? Can you still see a 10-year return after it has risen in that manner? If the answer is to a certain extent, yes, right? Giving all the nuances of errors in your forecast, then you continue to hold on. Don't be worried about the fact that it has gone up by 200-300%, but generally many people would exit seeing that returns. How do you make multi-baggers? You make multi-baggers only when you can do that crystal ball gazing. You can't do multi-baggers when you are thinking only next year, right? So we need to take that tough step, need to gaze a little bit as what can happen, and buy decisions and hold based on those decisions. So our buying and holding period, it doesn't revolve around the analyst 1-year targets. That's what I'm trying to get at. That's one. Then the other question that you had is, when do you exit? Exit is somewhere art and science. The science part of it is just not numbers. The science part of it is also trying to see whether there's capital misallocation which has happened, right? In terms of if the business has gone and acquired something that we don't like, and it's a complete divergence to what we thought the initial investment thesis was, then we want to correct that and get out of a business, because we think that in many cases when capital allocation happens to a sizable new business, it tends to destroy incremental return on investments, right? And if that happens, it's very difficult for a business to get out of it. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, as we call it, as correcting our misjudgments, right? And it happens. It's not like all of us are Supermans and Marvel heroes. At times we make our mistakes. We make mistakes in trying to figure out the execution capability of a business. We think one and something else happens, right? And we realize for time and again that there is something is amiss and it's not able to keep up, right? And then when we dig and we learn what is amiss, we need to correct, right? Similarly, there are some times when we think about capabilities of a manager, right, or an owner to capture market opportunities, right, by launching a few things or by expanding whatever brands that they have. Those things don't happen in the manner in which they happen. So there are many chances and there are times where we feel that we have to correct our misjudgments. Times when we have bought something and we have gone across the markets for many years and we've started noticing that some business which is complete competitor to the existing business that we have is doing a far better job, right, in all aspects that we can think about. that's the time sometimes we make a switch call as well, saying that, this is the far greater business than that what we own. This is where we should have been. So those are the times when you need to take tough calls and say, we need to exit, right? Or partially exit. But generally when we exit wholeheartedly. Just like how when we buy something, we buy wholeheartedly. So that's the way we look at things from a buy and a sell angle.
With respect to holding period, Alder's way of looking at things is at a given point in time, they look at the next 5-year or 10-year CAGR that a stock can deliver, and basis they take decisions on exit. Typically, when they decide to exit a company, either due to misjudgment or for a better opportunity, they tend to do, as sir said, like a wholehearted exit. Sir, it is generally perceived that the cap mix of a portfolio can decide how bumpy is going to be the ride. So typically a portfolio which has a skew towards small cap would generally be expected to have higher drawdowns. While you explained us that at Alder, you typically don't look at a cap mix, it's rather a 4 broad category mix that you look at. Could you give us some highlight on what could be the cap mix today at Alder's portfolio?
So we are roughly around 65% large cap, 25% mid cap, and around the balance, which is small cap, right? But this is not how we build our portfolio, like I said earlier on. It so happened that we got businesses which were strong enough and available at a great price, which happened to be large caps, and that's how we bought those. I think the question that you asked in terms of drawdown, and I want to actually elaborate that in another manner, is since we invest into B2C businesses, consumption businesses generally tend to have low volatility. They have low beta, right? So when the markets fall by, let's say, 10%, consumption businesses typically tend to fall by 5%, right? And that's the nature. It's not what I'm saying today, but it's the nature what's been there for 2 decades, right? And if you build a portfolio of, let's say, whether it is large or mid or small cap consumer stocks, generally these stocks don't move in that manner, right? They tend to move less in the markets. Let me put it this way. When you build a concentrated portfolio, even then it doesn't impact. Our portfolio betas are 0.75, right? A 0.75 means is well lower than the market. So in November, when the markets actually cracked, we were flat and the markets in various sectors were down dramatically. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bulletproof portfolio. I'm just saying that the impact is relatively lower. But if you build, let's say, even a 30 stock portfolio of, let's say, a commodity or a cyclical sector, well, no matter 30 or 50 or even 100 stocks you might have, you're going to fall as bad as the markets or even a lot more, right? Because these are cyclical sectors. They tend to actually have a very adverse business cycle, and when things go wrong and when the super cycle of commodities burst, they tend to have a huge sell-off mode. So you've got to be careful about what you're buying into, because there are certain businesses like IT, there are certain businesses like pharma, which generally tend to be counter-cyclical, like consumers. They don't get impacted as much as markets do. But there are other sectors which get far more impacted generally, which are engineering, infrastructure, banking. So you've got to understand where you are and where you're playing. If you have all of these, right, then you're going to be as good as the market in terms of your drawdown and volatility, right? But if you're going to be positioned in one side of it, then it's going to be far less volatile. So for us, that's one part of volatility, but the other part of volatility is making sure that you buy great businesses, which tend to be even more less. So we keep telling investors that generally when an FI or a mutual fund wants to exit India, the first thing that he'll exit is all those other businesses, and he'll keep the Navratnas. You don't sell the family jewels, right, at the first leg. You sell the family jewels when you have no hope left. That's what typically happens.
So for our clients/investors who are concerned about drawdowns in the short term, because that is when they matter, in the long term they don't matter, while Alder operates in the consumption arena, typically these stocks are also dubbed as defensives. Alder's portfolio today consists more than 65% large cap and has a portfolio beta of 0.75. Beta simply means that when the benchmark index moves by 1 percentage point, you typically see the portfolio moving by 75 basis point. So we have these two schools of thought where investors, are focused or hyper focused on value investing, and then there are also investors who are willing to pay a higher price for growth. Given that Alder's focus is on consumption stocks, do you look at only growth stocks, or is there a way by which you balance between value and growth?
So, what are value businesses in India? Right? Value businesses in India could be businesses which are regulated, which have or government businesses, or which have are cyclical in nature, or have some serious corporate governance issue, or have low ROIs, right? And these are all typically value businesses, right? The question one should ask is, do you want to own these businesses? Are you going to be happy owning an infrastructure company which does growth probably 5 years out of 20 years? Or are you happy owning a PSU bank? Or are you happy owning a mining company like Coal India? So there are a lot of businesses which are value businesses because of the sector and their current situation. And what are growth businesses? India is a market which is growing at 13% in nominal terms from post-liberalization, right? And this is the consumption side I'm talking about, for over 38 years, right? So since 1991. Now there are many businesses in India which are able to grow well ahead of the 13%, right? Our journey of what we are trying to do over here is to figure out which are these businesses which can deliver that. Now, if you're going to find a business which is growing lower than the country's consumption growth rate, what have you achieved in a sense? So essentially, when we are trying and striving to buy businesses which are growing over 13% per annum, we tend to be called as growth investors, right? I don't classify my universe as value or growth, but we look at businesses where we are able to buy great businesses which can deliver this ahead of the country and ahead of the sectoral growth rates at a reasonable price, right? And then that's our endeavor.
How often do you come across turnaround stories in the consumption space? It's generally believed that while investing in turnaround companies could be risky, but the upside is that it could turn out to be multi-bagger. Does Alder have any turnaround story in its portfolio as on today?
There's a saying where turnarounds seldom turn around, right? And the reason for that is that while you might see many businesses going through adverse cycles, some of these, and let me focus on the consumption side of it. Let's say that you're buying a business which is brand driven, right? And it goes through an adverse cycle and it's lost its customers. Typically, brand businesses lose their customers not one fine day in the morning. It could happen, like in the case of Nestle, where the Maggi incident happened and suddenly you had half the people not consuming Maggi, but today it's back again to the square one of where it had in terms of market share. But in many other instances, brands don't necessarily lose their customers overnight. They lose it over 4 or 5 years and slowly and steadily, because certain things that the management or the business has not done for the customers in terms of value or in terms of innovation or in terms of packaging, or it could be any other reasons, right? We generally don't find, we call it as sinking brands, right? And then suddenly one fine day an event happens and the brand starts doing extremely well, right? It's rare. Do we try to seek those brands? I don't think so, right? Because just like how it takes a slow momentum for things to collapse, it was equally slow on the upside. To win a customer, you can't just win him overnight. If you've lost him, like for instance, I give a good example. Everyone knew what Nirma was, right? But they've lost a set of customers in a big way. And then a new guy came in, Gari, which actually did far more better. And Lever is where it is, but the bottom space has been eaten away and lost by a few players. But it takes time. And the point is that consumption businesses, what we have traditionally seen is turnarounds typically happen very slowly in case of brands, very slowly in case of business that are switching cost. Production advantages might have a little bit of swings up and down. And similarly in case of network effect businesses, right? So we don't, first of all, seek businesses which are in destitute first. The second assumption that you can create a multi-bagger only when the business is in destitute is a fallacy, right? That's not true. Let me give you an example. We had bought Dr. Lal Path Labs post IPO after it went up at a very crazy level, and then people shot it down saying, well, this business has got no pricing power, right? And people like Thyrocare and Reliance at that time came and said that they're going to get into diagnostics. So Reliance is going to come, all the private equity guys in the world are going to come, and they're going to set up diagnostic labs, like they're going to set up fruits and vegetable stalls right next to each other, and everything is going to crash, burn and die. For us, it was a business of trust. You can't win a customer's trust by simply setting up shops right next to each other, right? You need to do a lot more things to build a trust, right? And a customer is not seeking cheap value, he's seeking quality when he's going in for a test. So if his doctor says you spend 2,000, 3,000 rupees more for a better test, he will do it, right? So that trust is very important. And if you bought this at that particular moment and you waited, right? And this is definitely a mid cap at that stage, and today has become a slightly a large cap, right? It has delivered 5 times returns in the last 4 years, right? Now, you didn't need to do buying a stressful business. You could have bought one. You could have bought maybe Thyrocare. It's not that Thyrocare did not do very well. Thyrocare also did very well, but you still had a stock that you owned, slept well at night, and still deliver the returns that you wanted. So multi-baggers can come at every walk of life. It does not have to be from a stress situation. You just have to be you got to make sure. See, multi-baggers at the end of the day, whether a business is great or whether a business is turning around, essentially what you're trying to say is that the business is doing well, right? So why don't you just focus on which business is actually doing well, rather than priming it, this might happen and that might happen. So our essential focus is that we don't mind seeking multi-baggers over long run. It's patience which delivers, and see great businesses.
Sir, we understand that the broader theme for Alder is consumption, and you also explained how you funneled out the Super 70 from the BSE 500. But is there a negative list? Are there any red flags that make you drop coverage on a certain company? Is there even a negative list of company management or group of companies?
The first filtering process, as you said, is filtering the entire universe to what we want to do, which is B2C. The second filtering process is what you said is a negative list, where we build. Now, there are 2 main criteria where we evaluate businesses and where we put them on a no-go list, right? The first one being is where we have governance issues, where the owner has got more incentives to seek incentives inappropriately because he barely owns 5% of the business today, right? And that becomes a big problem for us because that leads to misappropriation and all sorts of misallocations. Similarly, there are businesses which are complex, right, in nature, and the management doesn't have time to dedicate onto one single line of business where we might have been invested, and there's so much of time and effort which goes into so many other businesses. We are not keen on it then. At the same time, sometimes managers reward themselves excessively, right? There are classic cases like Sun TV, where the returns that the management takes as salaries are a significant portion of the profit before tax, right? And we typically don't like this misalignment, because if you are doing a serious job, right, like maybe let's say Tim Cook does, or let's say Elon Musk does, right, you might as well gain out of it from the market cap. Why do you need to incentivize yourself from the profits of the business, right? And if you're seeking profits, be just about it, not being disproportionate about it vis-a-vis the markets. So that's one where we worry about governance, where there are a lot of other issues on governance that we can talk about, but we are very careful about this. Once it goes into the no-go side, it takes a lot for it to come back. The other aspect where we have a definite negative list is sometimes the industry structure itself is not sensible, right? There's high competitive rivalry because of various competitors, which doesn't allow operators, companies within that sector to make reasonable economic returns, right? For instance, aviation is a classic example where you might have multiple entries and exits, and airline companies don't generate those kind of returns. Globally, it is proven right? There might be one or two companies which do extremely well for whatever reason, but to say that they will systematically create value over long run is a question mark. So there are industries which are sunset industries, where when we buy a business, like I told you, we are doing a 10-year analysis, and then suddenly you realize that you bought this business, but on the 10th year, I don't know whether it will exist or not. That's a problem, because investors who are seeing forward are not going to pay an astronomical price for an industry which might not survive in the next 10 years. A classic example is where industry has become a problem is the lubricant industry, where Castrol was once upon a time touted as one of the great companies to actually buy and hold. Today it quotes at a dividend yield and a mid-teen valuations, well lower than the market PE also, right? There is a cable industry, which is a sunset industry, right? Why would you want to own a cable industry when everything is going to go satellite communications very soon, right? And Facebooks and the world and Bharti are doing it, right? And you would get it on your phone directly. Why would you want to go to cables? There's another one where we see industries which have got very high regulatory friction. Alcoholic beverages industry, tobacco industry, where the prices keep rising, but who benefits out of it? The government. The company doesn't benefit out of it, because the net price that the company realizes per unit more or less remains the same. The growth is like stunted, and the customer pays a higher price. If the customer continues to pay a higher price, how is he going to consume more? And these are sin categories at the end of the day. So there are various places where we put a negative list. Not everything that we seek in consumer businesses is gold, but we just got to be careful about what we select.
Primarily, if there is a problem in governance, or if there is a problem in industry structure, it simply pops up on the negative list radar of Alder Capital. Sir, while India rallies to become a $5 trillion economy, there is a disruption that is coming in from technology's end, and it's fairly rapid. And possibly the magnitude of impact might be highest in the consumption space, where Alder's primary focus is. So in such a scenario, how do you safeguard, or how do you keep a track of these technology advancements which could impact one of Alder's portfolio company?
So many businesses that we own are traditional till date, and obviously that's changing at the margins as we get to see new tech businesses getting listed. But to answer the question that how technology is disrupting businesses today in India, let me put it this way. The largest amount of capital that has been invested into the Indian equity markets by venture capitalists, right, have gone into mainly two space, right? One, the financials, and the other one is e-com, right? These two are the largest spaces where actual capital has been deployed. And if you think about it, what is changing from a consumer perspective is, think about this scenario that for many decades in a row, consumers have sought materialistic needs, right? They have fulfilled their desires to own a durable, they have fulfilled their desires to own maybe a car, maybe food requirements, and all of those needs, in at least in many advanced countries in the world, have been fulfilled. There's the penetrations of televisions, refrigerators, cars are really at the peak levels. What are consumers today desiring? They're seeking experience, they are seeking some things services that can solve their problems, they are seeking entertainment, right? These are the things that they are incrementally willing to spend on. And with that, if you look at India, India too has gone through another curve on the urban side of it, right? At urban markets, many consumers have got, refrigerator penetration is 70%, right? So it's not like everyone who has to have a refrigerator has a refrigerator, even the smallest household in the urban side of it. So when that's the fulfillment which is happening, everyone has got table televisions, everyone's got a TV at home, right? The need has changed, and with that need changing, it disrupts certain sectors which are high frequency, which are commoditized, and which can be replicated very easily. So let me ask you a question, again going back to the Maggi noodles and the Doves of the world. Can technology disrupt Maggi noodles and Doves of the world?
Possibly not.
Absolutely. Can technology disrupt maybe footwear brands and apparel brands to a certain extent. Let's say for an Amazon marketplace, you might have many apparel brands and you might have many footwear brands. But at the end of the day, a customer who walks into the Amazon store, is he just going to buy any brand? Probably not, because there has to be a lot of effort made by the company to make sure that they market these brands and consumers connect, consumers transact, use those products and say that, wow, these are high quality products that I'm spending for, and they come back. There's a repeat, right, which happens. Typically, more often than not, many branded businesses gain market share after they get onto tech platforms. Many cases. In many businesses that we know, market platforms like e-commerce platforms are a way in which they can distribute their products and services. FMCG companies talk about 7% of the revenues to 8% of the revenues coming through tech platforms. There are many other companies which talk about, some apparel companies are saying that 20% of the revenues are coming through tech platforms. It's a distribution model, right? Does it make them weaker? It doesn't. Now take another business altogether. There are businesses like financial services. Now, financial services is a commoditized business. You don't go after taking a loan saying, oh, this is a loan from HDFC Bank or this is a loan from SBI. You're fine with either one of those loans so long as the loan comes to you faster and it's at a cheaper price, and so long as they take care of a little bit of consumer servicing aspects, right? So, the end of the day, those are the business which gets disrupted faster. If you are a retail company and you need to buy a space and you need to sell from that space, well, there are another platform, digital platforms, which do it with asset-light, in an asset-light way, right? So they don't need a prime location. They can be in cloud and they can sell products and services. Those are the places where it gets disrupted faster. So disruption is not all across. Disruption is in certain parts, right? Are we wary of those parts? Absolutely. We worry about them every day. We own businesses which have disrupted traditional businesses, but are likely to be disrupted by the new age businesses, and we know that the direction where it's going. So yes, tech is something which is happening in India in the unlisted space. We are now on the listed space getting to see this disruption, but it's been there for the last 10 years and has been doing what it's been doing. We are extremely careful about the kind of investments that we do, and as we go along, while we invest into traditional businesses, we hope that we gravitate towards owning these new age businesses as well on the consumer side.
Technology could be a disruption in financial services, but could actually be an enabler for some of these traditional consumer businesses, and not necessarily a disruptor in all consumption companies all throughout. So what is Alder's take on these e-commerce / consumer tech companies? Is this the story of the decade? Are they really loss-making, or what is the right perspective? How should one look at these companies?
So, going back to the original thesis, India is 60% consumption, right? But the market cap representation of the 60% consumption is only 38%. So, obviously, there's somewhere a 22% miss, right, in terms of the size of the economy versus market cap not being there. Whereas in many other cases where we say India is still lagging in financial inclusion, right, market cap representation is over 35%, right? So there is obviously a disconnect. And as you know, decadal, how market weightages across sectors have changed. For us, the way we look at it is, there are, as I know, as on today, we just refresh our data, and there are somewhere around 75 odd unicorns, right? And these 75 unicorns have a value based on either few of them listed and those which are unlisted based on the last round of funding, somewhere around $200 billion. Now, these are definitely growing 2x or 3x of the sector growth rate. Classic point is digital lending is growing at somewhere around 25% per annum on an average, right, and expected to grow at that level. Whereas lending itself in India on a gross basis, let's say retail lending itself, is growing at just about barely 10-12%, right, at best. So you can imagine that these businesses are growing much faster, and as they grow, they will create more value. We believe that probably in the next 3 or 4 years, their value could be of $500-600 billion. And mind you, 9 out of the top 10 unicorns are in consumer businesses. Right. So what does it mean when these come up for listing? And you had 3 of them which came up for listing just recently. They collectively have a lakh crore market cap each, close to a lakh crore. Some of them have gone lower and some of them have gone over. But a 3 lakh crore market cap just created in no time, effectively landing up with 2.5% of India's top 100 companies. So top 100 companies in India are $2 trillion, and these new tech businesses are around 2.5%. Now you compare this with, let's say, in US and China. The top 100 businesses in US, 38% of that market cap is consumer tech. In China, it's 31%. In India, it's just 2.5%. Where are we going to go with all these unicorns when they list? And in the next 3 to 4 years, we believe that probably around 13 to 15% of India's market cap will become consumer tech, right? And that's where this gap that I was telling you, where consumption is but market cap is not there, that will bridge. So in our opinion, consumption will be by large, the largest sector that one can play, right, in 5 years out. But in 5 years out, it will probably become 50 to 55% of India's market capitalization. Yes, these businesses, many of them are loss making, right? Some of them are cash burn, but some of them are not. Nykaa is not a cash burn business anymore, right? Zomato is today finally charging its customers. It started charging its customers only the year before last, right? Where it started saying, I'll charge you for delivery. Then it says, I'll charge you for tips. And that's the monetization game that is charging you and me, who are actually users of it. It was another thing that they're charging the restaurants, but obviously there has to be a balance. And the unit economics are becoming positive, right? At the pre-marketing and sales level. Now, consumer tech businesses go through that journey. They are at a loss and they write off all those investments that they do. But these are asset-light businesses. When you compare any traditional businesses, they invest into land, machinery, plant, and they capitalize it, and then they write it off over many years, and they call themselves profitable on day one. Fair enough. But these businesses have a very high operating leverage, the consumer tech businesses, because you're writing off everything. And when you're writing off everything and the unit economics turn, the day when they hit a balance in terms of monetization, they will throw huge profits. Now, this has happened in many parts of the world. If you analyze the US markets, there were 45 odd companies which are new age businesses compared to 100 similar types of businesses in traditional businesses I'm talking about in a comparable sector. And when you compare this new age versus traditional businesses, these new age businesses grew faster, had higher profits, had higher ROEs, and delivered more value. And this is the span of 20 years in the US, right? Can this happen in India? Obviously. People say India is a country of have-nots and low income level. I agree with that, but that's today. But if you want to see the glass is always half empty, then there is no end to it. In my opinion, glass is already half full, and the way India is growing, which is the fastest growing economy in the world, you will get to a point where the income levels are so good that consumers will seek experience, aspirations to seek better services and solutions. And that's where all these consumer tech businesses will do extremely well. Meaning I'm talking about the monetization part. So I don't think that one should judge these businesses on today's losses. They have come through an evolution process of many years of making losses, being funded. I respect all those people who have put in that capital because consumers have benefited of it. So I keep saying, follow the consumer. If they say that this is a great product, like at some point you will see Eureka happening, right? So yeah, we are extremely bullish on this space.
So 2 key takeaways for our clients / investors on the part where can consumer tech be the story of the decade? Well, it very well can be. A key takeaway from Sir's conversation was it accounts only for 2.5% of today's market cap compared to 38% comparable number in the US. And the perspective with respect to whether these companies are loss making or are they making money, I think Sir's point is to simply see the money spent on acquiring these customers not as OPEX but as CAPEX, and the P&L would just change drastically. Sir, let me try and conclude with the most common question that you would be coming across, but it's a necessary one. What is Alder Capital's market outlook from here?
The near term versus the long term, right? The near term challenge is that the global economy is stepping its foot off the liquidity pedal, right? You have had the biggest stimulus that all central bankers around the world have done in 2020. The highest liquidity injection that has happened post-COVID, right? That stimulus has any which ways been on a downslide in 2021. Now you have another problem that all this liquidity which has been injected into the system by the central bankers, not India. India's stimulus was relatively very less, but I'm really talking about the major economies, is finding its ways into assets, commodities, real estate, name it. And it obviously found its way into equity markets. So while this normalization process is happening, now you have bankers, and the first one being UK, which took up its interest rates. I think that calendar year 21, you're going to have a rising interest rate environment with high inflations and obviously low liquidity, right, versus what it was in the past. In that scenario, typically you would have asset prices globally at least move sideways or probably move downwards, right? In India, as we speak, we have another unusual situation, as you might call it, as is that many businesses are coming up for listing, right? What many businesses, when they come up for listing, do is they suck out more liquidity from the market, from the secondary market. So effectively, stocks that you and I own, right, have got this pressure of people trying to sell those to buy the new businesses, right? And therein, the issue of markets prices of the existing businesses trying to do another new high seems to be a little bit difficult. So in the short run, I think there are more challenges. The positive is the fact that we have had earnings growth in India for the last 2 years, which is at over 23% CAGR. I'm including this year, which I believe that we will end with a positive note. When was the last time that we had 23% CAGR in earnings? Well, that was way back in 2008.
Oh.
Now imagine that we had said this to anyone that, you're going to have tremendous earnings growth in corporate India at the time when COVID has hit, right? Nobody would have believed it. So markets are unusual. Markets are full of surprises. None of us know everything. That's the caveat out here. But the point being, if we continue that journey and we have finally managed to do earnings growth that we have desperately wanted for over a decade, right, since the financial crisis, and we have not got it. And when prior to this, we were growing at an earnings growth of around 5 to 6% as corporate India. We're finally doing it. Thanks to what? It's thanks to the formalization which is happening in a big way. And that's contributing to higher tax revenues for the government, which is actually the highest level. The government will be exceeding its tax budget for this year, which is a rarity as well, right? It never happens that you predict and you exceeded it. So all these are the positive things. So we have certain positive things which will dampen this impact of liquidity outflow. So in the near term, it's a challenge. I don't think markets have got serious legs to outperform. Talking about the longer term story, India has been in an ICU since 2016. You had Demon, you had GST, you had the self-homebrewed financial crisis, and then you had COVID, which is a global incident. We have had so many things where corporate India couldn't have actually performed in a big way. Demand has taken a backseat. One of the weakest links in India's growth has been the demand. Now, typically what happens to the world is they go into stimulus drive. What stimulus does is it improves demand conditions across the world, and that's why you're seeing inflation. So for India also, there's the same thing is happening, so that we are finally getting to see demand pick up structurally. And as an economy, we feel that if the patient is just coming out of his ICU and is willing to run, then you have a chance that all sectors will see much better levels of demand. Plus, there's a lot of effort been made to increase the capex, improve the investments in India and improve the capex cycle, right? If all of these plays out, you probably would have a great decade going ahead, right? We have gone through stress, we have gone through reforms, we have gone through healthcare crisis, but if you really ask me, we have done large bit of that challenges and corrections that we had to do in the last decade. Now this coming decade, I really feel that it will be a decade for consumption.
Sir, would you be kind enough to give some closing remarks or a piece of advice to our clients/investors who would be looking forward to appoint Alder as their PM?
Sure. So, if you truly believe that India is going to go through its journey of an incredible structural growth and consumption in the next decade is going to become the third largest economy in terms of consumption economy globally, then there is no other better fund to look at, but you can look at us because we are a consumption focused fund. While we traverse through this journey, we will tell our investors that we continue to strive to maintain high business integrity and transparency so that you can sleep well at night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this opportunity and giving us an inside view on Alder Capital.
Thanks a lot and wish you all the best for your journey as an incredible wealth creator and an advisor for your investors.